I'm Norma Preston, 67, and I lost my husband James on Flight 93. We'd been married for 32 years, built a life together, raised our children, and were finally looking forward to retirement. James was 63, a gentle man who called me every morning when he traveled for work. That September morning was supposed to be just another business trip. Then, his parents, who had barely spoken to us in years after a family dispute, suddenly appeared at my door with lawyers. They claimed that, as his blood relatives, they had more right to his estate than I did as just his wife. They said I'd manipulated their son, isolated him from family, and now they wanted everything: his life insurance, our home, even his personal belongings. I was drowning in grief and legal battles I couldn't afford, fighting people who'd rejected us for decades, until a call from the Pentagon revealed something about James that would change everything I thought I knew about that horrible day. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt invisible in your own grief, or questioned what family really means, like this video. September 11th, 2001, started like any other Tuesday. James was up at 5:30 a.m., making coffee in the kitchen while I dozed in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his morning routine. After 32 years of marriage, I knew every step: the shower running, the electric razor humming, the gentle clink of his coffee cup on the counter. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, sitting on the edge of our bed with his steaming mug. His hair was still damp from the shower, and he smelled like the aftershave I'd given him for his birthday. Flights at 8:15, should be back by Thursday evening. I stretched and smiled at him. Another thrilling consulting meeting. "You know it," he laughed. But there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. "This one's important though. Could lead to bigger things." James had been doing more consulting work lately, traveling to DC and New York for meetings he described as government contract stuff. I didn't after 3 decades together, we'd learned to give each other space for our work lives. He kissed my forehead and handed me something small and cool: our wedding ring, the one he'd been wearing since 1969. "Keep this safe for me, James. You always wear your ring when you travel." "I know," but he paused, looking down at his hands. "Just this once, for luck." I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed him to explain why he seemed different, more serious, almost melancholy. Instead, I slipped the ring onto my thumb and kissed him goodbye. "I love you, Norma, more than you'll ever know." "I love you too. Call me when you land." That was the last time I saw my husband alive. I was having coffee with my neighbor Ruth when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. We watched in horror as the news anchors tried to make sense of what looked like a terrible accident. Then the second plane hit, and we knew it was no accident. My heart started racing. James was flying to Newark that morning. I called his cell phone. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. "Norma, what airline was James on?" Ruth asked, her face pale. "United. Flight 93. The words felt like stones in my throat. We sat, glued to the television as the nightmare unfolded. The Pentagon, the towers falling, and then, around 10:30 a.m., the news that would destroy my world. United Flight 93 had crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. I don't remember much about the rest of that day. Ruth called our children. Neighbors brought food. The phone rang constantly from family, James's colleagues, all asking the same impossible questions. Was he really on that flight? Had we heard anything? Was there any chance there wasn't? The official confirmation came 2 days later. James Robert Preston, age 63, passenger on United Flight 93. Among the heroes who fought back against the terrorists, who saved countless lives by preventing the plane from reaching its target in Washington, D.C. My James, quiet, gentle James, who worried about stepping on ants, had died fighting terrorists. But even in my grief, I held on to that final voicemail message he'd left on my phone just before boarding. "Hey sweetheart, about to get on the plane. I love you so much. Can't wait to get home and hold you. This trip is going to change everything for us. I promise." I played that message 100 times, trying to understand what he meant. Change everything, how? I had no idea that within days, his parents would appear to answer that question in the most devastating way possible. The first few days, after 9/11s, were a blur of grief, paperwork, and impossible decisions. While the rest of the country was trying to process the enormity of what had happened, I was drowning in the practical realities of sudden widowhood, The death certificate became my most important document, a piece of paper that reduced 32 years of marriage to a few typed lines. James Robert Preston died September 11, 2001. Cause of death: terrorist attack. I needed copies for the insurance company, the bank, the mortgage company, the pension fund. Each request felt like another small death. Our children, Michael and Sarah, flew in from their respective coasts. Michael, our oldest at 34, took charge of the logistics with military precision. Sarah, third, focused on the emotional support, fielding calls from friends and organizing the constant stream of visitors, bringing casseroles and condolences. But James's parents were nowhere to be found. "Have you heard from Grandma and Grandpa Preston?" Sarah asked on the third day, as we sat in the living room surrounded by flower arrangements and sympathy cards. I shook my head. Nothing, not even a phone call. Michael looked up from the stack of paperwork he was organizing. Should I call them? No. The word came out sharper than I intended. If they wanted to be here, they would be. The truth was, I hadn't spoken to Robert and Helen Preston in over 8 years. The last time had been at Sarah's college graduation, where they'd made it clear that they'd blamed me for their son's decision to maintain distance from them. Helen had cornered me at the reception, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've turned our son against us, Norma. You've poisoned him against his own family." I'd tried to explain that James made his own choices, that I'd never asked him to cut contact with them. But Helen wasn't interested in explanations. In her mind, I was the villain who'd stolen her son, and nothing would change that. So their absence during the worst week of my life shouldn't have surprised me, but it hurt nonetheless. Whatever our differences, James was their son, their only child. How could they not come? The funeral arrangements were a nightmare. Because James had died in a terrorist attack, his body wasn't immediately available for burial. The FBI was treating Flight 93 as a crime scene, and it would be weeks before we could have a proper service. In the meantime, I had to plan a memorial service without knowing when we'd have closure. I spent hours on the phone with the funeral home, the church, the cemetery. James had never talked much about his final wishes at 63. Death had seemed like a distant concern. I found myself making decisions I wasn't qualified to make, choosing flowers he'd never see, music he'd never hear. The financial aspects were equally overwhelming. James had been meticulous about our finances, but I'd never paid attention to the details. Now I was drowning in insurance policies, retirement accounts, and legal documents I didn't understand. The life insurance company needed proof of death. But what kind of proof do you provide when your husband died in a terrorist attack? "Mom, you need to see this," Michael said one evening, holding up a manila folder he'd found in James's desk. Dad had everything organized. Insurance policies, will, even instructions for the funeral. I stared at the folder, my hands shaking. James had been preparing for this. Why hadn't he told me? Inside were documents dated just 2 months earlier, updated insurance beneficiaries, a revised will, even a letter addressed to me in James's careful handwriting. The letter was brief. "Norma, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I want you to know that every decision I've made in the past year has been to protect you and our family. Trust no one but our children and our lawyer, David Chen. I love you more than life itself." James. What did he mean? Protect our family. Protect us from what? I was about to find out. The community support was overwhelming. James's colleagues from the consulting firm sent flowers and shared memories of his kindness and professionalism. Our church organized meal trains and housekeeping help. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by with offers to run errands or simply sit with me when the house felt too quiet. But the person I needed most, the one person who could have helped me understand what James meant in his letter, was gone. And his parents, the people who should have been grieving alongside me, remained mysteriously absent until they weren't. 2 weeks after the attacks, I was finally starting to establish some kind of routine. The initial wave of visitors had subsided, the casseroles had been eaten or frozen, and I was learning to navigate the quiet house without James's presence. I was in the kitchen, mechanically sorting through sympathy cards, when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw 2 figures I hadn't seen in years, Robert and Helen Preston, James's parents. They looked older, more frail than I remembered, but their expressions were as cold as ever. Behind them stood a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. My heart sank. After 2 weeks of silence, they were here now, and with a lawyer. I opened the door, trying to summon some grace despite my exhaustion. "Robert, Helen, I'm surprised to see you, Norma. Helen's voice was clipped, formal. She made no move to hug me or offer condolences. We need to talk. Robert stepped forward, his face a mask of barely contained anger. This is our attorney, Marcus Webb. We have some legal matters to discuss regarding James's estate. Legal matters. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I'm sorry, what? May we come in? The lawyer asked, his voice professionally pleasant but cold. This would be better discussed privately. I had no choice but to let them in. We sat in the living room, where I'd received hundreds of condolence visitors over the past 2 weeks, the same room where James and I had watched the morning news on September 11th, where we'd laughed at something silly on television just hours before his death. Mrs. Preston, the lawyer, began, pulling documents from his briefcase. We're here to discuss the matter of James Robert Preston's estate and the validity of certain claims upon it. I don't understand. I'm his wife. I'm the beneficiary of his life insurance, his retirement accounts. That's exactly what we're here to discuss. Helen interrupted, her voice sharp. James was our son, our only son, and we have reason to believe that his estate should rightfully come to us, his blood relatives, not to. She paused, her eyes scanning me with disgust. Not to someone who manipulated him into cutting ties with his family. I felt like I'd been slapped, manipulated. Him. James made his own decisions about you, isolated him, Robert said, his voice rising. You turned our son against us. You poisoned him against his own parents, and now you think you can benefit from his death. The lawyer held up a hand, trying to regain control of the conversation. What my clients are suggesting is that there may be grounds to challenge the estate distribution. In cases where a spouse has deliberately interfered with family relationships, there are legal precedents. Stop. I stood up, my whole body shaking. Just stop. James died 2 weeks ago. I haven't even had a funeral yet, and you're here talking about legal precedents. We're talking about justice, Helen said, her voice ice cold. James would never have wanted his hard-earned money going to someone who destroyed his relationship with his family. I didn't destroy anything. The words came out as a shout. You destroyed it yourselves with your constant criticism. Your disapproval, we're prepared to file a formal challenge to the estate, the lawyer said, sliding a document across the coffee table. This is a legal summons. You're being sued for wrongful interference with family relationships and fraudulent influence over the deceased. I stared at the document, the words blurring through my tears. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when I was barely managing to get through. Each day, you have 30 days to respond, the lawyer continued. I'd recommend you secure legal representation immediately. Why are you doing this? I whispered. He was your son. Don't you care that he's gone? Helen's face was stone. We care enough to make sure his estate goes to people who actually loved him, not to the woman who stole him from us. Robert stood up, his hands clenched into fists. You have no idea what you put us through, Norma. Years of missed holidays, grandchildren who barely know us, a son who wouldn't even return our phone calls, all because of you. That's not true, isn't it? Helen's voice was venomous. Name one time in the past decade when you encouraged James to reconcile with us. One time when you suggested he call on our birthdays or visit for Christmas. I couldn't answer because, in a way, she was right. I hadn't encouraged those things. But not because I wanted to keep James from his parents, because I wanted to protect him from their constant judgment and criticism. You made your choice, Robert said, heading toward the door. You chose to tear this family apart. Now you'll live with the consequences. As they walked out, leaving me alone with the legal summons on my coffee table, I realized that my nightmare was just beginning. Not only had I lost my husband in the most horrible way imaginable, but now I was going to have to fight for the right to grieve him in peace. The house felt darker after they left, as if their presence had sucked the light out of the rooms. I picked up the summons with trembling hands, reading the legal language that reduced my 32-year marriage to fraudulent influence and wrongful interference. I needed help. I needed a lawyer. But most of all, I needed to understand what James had meant in his letter when he said he was trying to protect our family. From what? From whom? I was about to find out that the answer was more complicated than I could have ever imagined. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in James's study, surrounded by boxes of his papers, trying to make sense of the legal summons and the venom in his parents' voices. How had we gotten to this point? When had love turned into such bitter hatred? I found myself pulling out old photo albums, searching for clues about when the relationship had started to deteriorate. There were pictures from our wedding in 1969, and Helen looking proud and happy, dancing at the reception, laughing with their new dog. What had changed? In a shoebox behind James's desk, I discovered something I'd never seen before, a bundle of letters tied with string. The return address was from his parents' house in Philadelphia, dating from 1985 to 1993. With shaking hands, I untied the string and began to read. The first letter was from Helen, dated just after our son Michael's birth. James, we're so disappointed that you've chosen to spend Christmas with Norma's family again instead of coming home. This is the third year in a row. We feel like you're choosing her family over us, and it's breaking our hearts. Your father barely speaks about it, but I know he's hurt. We raised you better than this. We taught you about family loyalty, about honoring your parents. But ever since you married Norma, you've become a different person. Please reconsider. We love you, but we won't keep begging. Mother, I remembered that Christmas, Michael had been just 3 months old, and we'd decided to alternate holidays between families. James's parents had been invited to join us at my sister's house, but they'd refused, saying they wanted James to come home to them instead. The next letter was from Robert, dated 1987. Son, I'm writing because your mother is too upset to put pen to paper. Sarah's baptism was beautiful, but we were hurt that you asked Norma's brother to be the godfather instead of me. I would have been honored to serve in that role, but apparently, my own son doesn't consider me worthy. Your mother keeps asking what we did wrong, why you've pulled away from us. I told her it's not our fault. It's clear that Norma has been filling your head with ideas about how terrible we are. But James, you're our only child, our only son. Don't let her turn you against the people who love you most. I felt sick reading these letters. I remembered James agonizing over the godfather decision, ultimately choosing my brother Tom because he lived closer and would be more involved in Sarah's life. It wasn't about rejecting his father, it was about practicality. But the letters revealed a pattern I'd been blind to for years. Every decision James made, where to spend holidays, whom to choose as godparents, even where to live, was interpreted by his parents as evidence of my manipulation and their son's betrayal. Letters grew more bitter over time. By 1990, Helen was writing about the woman who stole our son, and Robert was accusing me of poisoning James against his own blood. They demanded that James choose between his wife and his parents, never understanding that such ultimatums only pushed him further away. The final letter in the bundle was from 1993, written after a particularly explosive Thanksgiving dinner at our house. James, after yesterday's debacle, your father and I have decided that we cannot continue to subject ourselves to Norma's hostility and disrespect. We invited ourselves into your home with open hearts, hoping to rebuild our relationship, but all we encountered was coldness and barely concealed contempt. Norma made it clear that we are not welcome in your life, and you stood by and let her humiliate us. We will not come begging again. If you want a relationship with your parents, you know where to find us. But don't expect us to pretend that woman is part of our family. We love you, but we will not be treated like strangers in our own son's home. This is goodbye unless you come to your senses. I remembered that Thanksgiving, I'd been 7 months pregnant with our third child, exhausted and emotional. Helen had criticized everything from my cooking to my parenting to the way I'd decorated the house. When she'd made a snide comment about how I was letting myself go during the pregnancy, I'd finally snapped and asked her to leave. James had been torn between defending me and maintaining peace with his parents. In the end, he'd chosen his pregnant wife over his critical mother, and his parents had stormed out, vowing never to return, and they hadn't. That had been the last time we'd seen them, until Sarah's college graduation, 8 years later. A tense, uncomfortable encounter that had reinforced everyone's decision to maintain distance. Reading these letters now, I could see how the situation had spiraled out of control. James's parents had felt replaced and rejected, while I'd felt constantly criticized and judged. James had been caught in the middle, trying to please everyone and ultimately satisfying no one. But the letters also revealed something else. James's parents had never stopped loving him. Their anger came from a place of deep hurt and loss. They'd convinced themselves that I was the villain who'd stolen their son, when in reality, we'd all contributed to the breakdown of our relationship now. With James gone, they were left with nothing but their grief and their anger, and I was the only target left for both as I sat in the quiet study, surrounded by the evidence of our family's long-standing dysfunction. I realized that the legal battle ahead wasn't really about money or inheritance. It was about love, loss, and the terrible price of pride. But understanding their pain didn't make their lawsuit any less devastating. If anything, it made it worse. Because now I knew that this wasn't just about legal precedent or estate law. It was about two parents who'd lost their son and were determined to make someone pay for their decades of heartbreak. And that someone was me. Finding a lawyer who could take on James's parents' estate challenge felt impossible. The first 3 attorneys I contacted either had conflicts of interest or quoted fees I couldn't afford on my teacher's pension. The fourth, David Chun, the lawyer James had mentioned in his letter, finally agreed to see me. David's office was modest but professional, filled with law books and family photos. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Preston, I was sorry to hear about James," he said, shaking my hand. "He was a good man, a careful man. You knew him well enough to know he loved you deeply and was very concerned about protecting you." David gestured for me to sit. He came to see me several times over the past year to update his estate planning, very thorough, very deliberate about his choices. I pulled out the legal summons with trembling hands. "His parents are suing me. They think I manipulated him into cutting them out of his life." David read through the documents, his expression growing more serious. "This is what we call a will contest, based on alleged undue influence. It's not uncommon in family disputes, but it's usually very difficult to prove. What exactly are they claiming? Essentially, that you exercised such control over James's decision-making that his estate planning doesn't reflect his true wishes. They're arguing that if not for your influence, he would have maintained a relationship with them and included them in his will." My heart sank. Can they win? David leaned back in his chair. "The good news is that spousal inheritance rights are very strong in this state. You were married for 32 years, you have adult children together, and James's recent estate planning documents are very clear about his intentions. The bad news is that litigation like this can be expensive and emotionally draining." He pulled out a thick folder. However, James was remarkably thorough in documenting his wishes. "Look at this." Inside were bank statements spanning the past 5 years, showing a clear pattern. James had systematically removed his parents from any joint accounts, changed beneficiaries on all policies, and even closed a small investment account they'd had access to as emergency contacts. "This wasn't done impulsively," David explained. "These changes spanned several years and were made gradually." James also wrote detailed memos to file explaining each decision. Memos. David handed me a sheet of paper, dated 2 years earlier. "Note, for estate planning file, have decided to remove parents as backup beneficiaries on life insurance policy. While I love them, their recent behavior toward Norma at Sarah's graduation convinced me they would not respect my wishes regarding her care and financial security. This decision is mine alone, made after much consideration. James R. Preston." There were similar memos for each financial change, each one carefully documenting James's reasoning and explicitly stating that the decisions were his own. "Your husband was building a legal firewall," David said. "He anticipated this exact scenario. But why? What made him think I stopped?" "The consulting work, the secretive phone calls, the way he'd been preparing for something." "Mrs. Preston, I need to ask you something confidential. Did James ever mention his work involving any kind of security clearance or government contracts?" I stared at him. "How did you know?" "Because some of his recent legal documents required special handling. There are aspects of his estate that I'm not even cleared to discuss with you yet." My head was spinning. What kind of aspects? "The kind that might make his parents' lawsuit the least of our worries." David's expression was grave. "I've been waiting for a call from some federal agencies. James told me they might need to get involved if anything happened to him." Federal agencies. James had been a management consultant, not a spy. What had he gotten himself into? "For now," David continued, "we focus on the immediate threat. Your in-laws' lawsuit is serious, but it's winnable. The question is whether you're prepared for what that fight might reveal about your husband's final months." I thought about James's strange behavior, his secrecy, the way he'd been preparing for something terrible. What choice do I have? None, really. They've forced this fight. "But Mrs. Preston, you need to be prepared. Based on what James told me, this lawsuit might expose things about his work that could change how you see his death. What do you mean? David was quiet for a long moment. James wasn't just a passenger on Flight 93. There are reasons the federal government is interested in his estate, reasons his parents can't be allowed to access certain information. Are you saying James was targeted? That he was supposed to be on that plane? I'm saying that when the federal agencies contact us and we're going to learn things about your husband's final mission that will put his parents' lawsuit in a very different light. I left David's office with more questions than answers, but with something I hadn't had in weeks. Hope. James had been protecting me, even from beyond the grave. Whatever secrets he'd been keeping, whatever dangerous work he'd been doing, he'd made sure I would be taken care of. But as I drove home through the October afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to learn things about my husband that would change everything I thought I knew about our marriage, his death, and the real reason his parents wanted his estate so desperately. The federal government was involved. James had been on some kind of mission, and his parents' lawsuit might be about much more than money or family grudges. I was about to discover that James hadn't just died as a hero on Flight 93, he had died as a target. That evening, I returned to James's study with new purpose. If he'd been building a legal firewall to protect me, there had to be more evidence hidden in his papers. I needed to find everything that could help David defend against his parents' lawsuit. I started with his desk drawers, methodically going through every file folder, every receipt, every scrap of paper. James had always been organized, but in the past year, he'd become almost obsessively so. Every document was labeled, dated, and filed in perfect order. In the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old tax returns, I found something unexpected, a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. The first entry was dated January 15, 2001, 8 months before his death. Started this journal on David Chen's advice. He says documentation of my decision-making process could be important if anything happens to me. Not sure what he means by anything, but recent events suggest I should be more careful about protecting Norma and the kids. Recent events? What events? I flipped to the next entry, dated February 3rd. Parents called again today. Third time this month. Dad was drunk, Mom was crying. They want to reconcile, but really, they want money. Dad's business is failing. I found out through Tom Morrison, who does their accounting. They owe $200,000 to creditors and are facing bankruptcy. Suddenly they want their son back. Norma doesn't know how desperate they are, and I won't tell her. She has enough to worry about with her mother's health issues. I felt sick. James's parents were broke. They'd been calling him for months, and he'd never mentioned it. March 12th. Mom showed up at my office today, crying, begging, saying they'd made mistakes, but they're still my parents. She asked for $150,000 to save Dad's business, said it was just a loan, that they'd pay me back. I told her I couldn't help them, that Norma and I have our own financial responsibilities. She got angry then, said I owed them for raising me, for sacrificing for my education, said Norma had made me selfish and ungrateful. I asked her to leave. April 20th. Dad called screaming that I was letting them lose everything, said blood is thicker than water, that a real son would help his parents. When I tried to explain that we couldn't afford that kind of loan, he said, "Your wife has made you weak. You used to be a man who took care of his family." Then he hung up. I'm changing my phone number again. I was crying now, reading about months of harassment and manipulation I'd known nothing about. James had protected me from all of it, dealing with his parents' increasingly desperate demands while maintaining a normal facade at home. May 8th. Interesting development. Mom called and was suddenly sweet as pie. Said they'd figured out their financial problems and didn't need help anymore. Asked about my work, specifically my consulting contracts. Too many questions about which companies I work for, what kind of clearances I have. Something's not right. Clearances. James had security clearances. June 15th. Confirmed my suspicions. Tom Morrison says my parents' debts have mysteriously disappeared. Someone paid off their creditors, but Tom doesn't know who. Dad suddenly has cash flow again. They're not returning my calls anymore. Whatever this is about, it's bigger than family drama. July 4th. Had to miss the family barbecue because of work. Special assignment. Can't talk about it even to Norma. She thinks I'm just traveling more for regular consulting. Might be better. That way, the less she knows about what I'm really doing, the safer she'd be if something goes wrong. August 18th. David Chen thinks I should update everything: will, insurance, beneficiaries. He's right. If my parents have gotten involved with people who could pay off $200,000 in debts, they're in deeper than I thought. Need to make sure Norma is protected if they come after my estate. September 1st. Final security briefing tomorrow. Still can't believe they want me for this operation. 20 years of boring management consulting, and suddenly, I'm valuable to national security. Guess all those years of analyzing corporate vulnerabilities finally paid off. Norma keeps asking why I seem so tense lately. Told her, it's just work, stress, hate, lying to her, but she can't know about this. September 10th, last entry before the mission. If something happens to me, I want Norma to know that everything I've done has been to protect her and our family. My parents made their choice when they took money from unknown sources. They've compromised themselves, and I won't let them drag my wife down with them. I love Norma more than life itself. She's been the best thing in my world for 32 years. I closed the journal with shaking hands. James hadn't just been preparing for death, he'd been preparing for his own parents to come after me. He'd known they were financially desperate and potentially compromised by whoever had paid their debts. But who would pay off $200,000 in gambling debts for a failed businessman and his wife, and why? I searched through more files and found bank statements showing the payments James had mentioned. In May 2001, Robert and Helen Preston had indeed received a series of large, cash deposits totaling exactly $200,000. The deposits came from something called Meridian Consulting Group. I'd never heard of Meridian Consulting, but James, apparently, had, in a file marked Security Concerns. I found a single sheet of paper with notes in James's handwriting. Meridian Consulting Front Company specializes in international business development. CEO is Marcus Webb, same name as the lawyer my parents brought to Norma's house. Connection. Why would a consulting firm pay my parents' debts unless they wanted something from me? Marcus Webb, the lawyer who'd served me with the lawsuit, was the same person who'd paid off James's parents' debts 6 months before 9/11. My husband hadn't just been a victim of terrorism, he'd been a target. And his parents weren't just grieving relatives trying to claim his estate, they were somehow connected to the people who'd wanted him dead. I picked up the phone to call David Chen, my hands shaking as I dialed. James's journal had given me the evidence I needed to fight his parents' lawsuit, but it had also revealed something much more terrifying. The people who'd killed my husband were still out there, and they were using his own parents to come after me. Whatever classified work James had been doing, whatever mission he'd died completing, it wasn't over. The war he'd been fighting was still being waged, and I was the next battlefield. David Chen's office felt different when I returned the next morning, armed with James's journal and the bank statements. The morning light streaming through his windows seemed harsher, and every shadow looked suspicious. After reading about Meridian Consulting and Marcus Webb, I was beginning to understand that this legal battle was about much more than family grievances. You were right, I told David, placing the journal on his desk. James was preparing for exactly this scenario. David read through the journal entries, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. Norma, this changes everything. Your husband wasn't just documenting family conflicts, he was tracking a counterintelligence operation. Counterintelligence, think about it. A consulting firm pays off his parents' debts, then their lawyer shows up to sue you for James's estate. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. David pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. What did you find about his insurance policies? I handed him a folder of documents I'd discovered in James's filing cabinet. He changed everything. In August, made me the sole beneficiary on all policies, removed his parents from any backup designations, even changed his emergency contacts at work. David examined the insurance paperwork, paying particular attention to the dates and signatures. Look at this. He didn't just change the beneficiaries, he upgraded the coverage amounts significantly. I hadn't noticed that detail. The life insurance policy I'd thought was worth $250,000 was actually worth $750,000. The accidental death benefit brought it to over $1 million. Why would he increase the coverage if he was just doing routine consulting work? Because he wasn't doing routine consulting work. David's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID. Actually, this might be the call I've been expecting. He answered with a formal David Chen, attorney. I watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Yes, She's here with me now. Yes, I understand the sensitivity. When can you meet? After he hung up, David looked at me with a mixture of excitement and concern. That was the Department of Defense. They want to meet with us this afternoon. The Department of Defense. Why? Because your husband was working for them when he died. And because they have information about Meridian Consulting that we need to hear. We spent the rest of the morning preparing for the meeting. David explained that whatever James had been doing was likely classified, which meant I might not be able to learn all the details. But if his work was related to his parents' lawsuit, the government might be willing to share enough information to help us defend against it. The meeting was held in a nondescript office building in downtown D.C. We were escorted to a windowless conference room where 2 federal agents were waiting. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI and Colonel James Patterson from Defense Intelligence. Mrs. Preston, Agent Martinez began. First, let me express our condolences for your loss. Your husband was a valuable asset to this country. Asset. Colonel Patterson leaned forward. For the past 18 months, your husband had been working as a consultant on a highly classified project involving corporate security vulnerabilities. His expertise in management systems made him invaluable for identifying weaknesses that foreign intelligence services might exploit. But he was just a business consultant who specialized in analyzing how companies could be compromised from within. Agent Martinez interrupted. That skill set made him perfect for identifying how foreign agents might infiltrate American corporations. Colonel Patterson slid a thick folder across the table. What I'm about to tell you is classified. But given the circumstances of the lawsuit against you, we've been authorized to share certain details. Inside the folder were documents showing that James had been investigating a network of shell companies suspected of being fronts for foreign intelligence operations. Meridian Consulting was at the center of that network. We believe your husband was targeted because his investigation was getting too close to exposing their operation, Agent Martinez explained. The 911 attacks provided them with perfect cover to eliminate him. I felt dizzy. Are you saying James was murdered? That he was specifically targeted? We're saying that when the terrorists were planning their operation, they had intelligence about which passengers would be on Flight 93. Your husband wasn't a random victim. He was a specific target whose death served multiple purposes. Colonel Patterson opened another file. Meridian Consulting has been under surveillance for 2 years. They specialize in recruiting Americans with financial problems and using them to gather intelligence on family members with security clearances. The pieces clicked into place. They paid off my in-laws' debts to get access to information about James. Exactly. Robert and Helen Preston were the perfect recruitment targets, financially desperate, estranged from their son, and angry enough to be manipulated into cooperation. Agent Martinez pulled out surveillance photos of James's parents meeting with Marcus Webb. These were taken in April 2001. Your in-laws provided detailed information about your husband's work schedules, travel patterns, and security clearances. I stared at the photos in horror. They helped plan his murder. They provided intelligence that was used by people who passed it to the 9/11's planners. Whether they knew how that information would be used is still under investigation. Colonel Patterson leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Preston, your in-law's lawsuit isn't about inheritance. It's about getting access to your husband's files and any classified materials he might have left at home. They're still working for Meridian Consulting. But why? He's dead. What more could they want? Your husband's final report. He was scheduled to deliver his complete findings on the Meridian network when he returned from his September 11th meetings. That report could expose an entire foreign intelligence operation. Agent Martinez opened her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. We need to know if your husband left any work materials at home, computer files, documents, anything related to his classified consulting work. I thought about James's study, his methodical filing system, the way he'd been so secretive about his work in recent months. There might be something. He had a safe in our basement that I've never been able to open. The agents exchanged glances. Colonel Patterson stood up. Mrs. Preston, we're going to need to search your house, and we're going to need you to open that safe. As we prepared to leave the meeting, Agent Martinez handed me her business card. One more thing. Your in-law's lawsuit is going to fail. We'll make sure of that. But you need to understand that they're still dangerous. Until we can prove their connection to Meridian Consulting, they're going to keep coming after you. What am I supposed to do? Trust your lawyer. Trust us. And remember that your husband died protecting information that could save other lives. His sacrifice wasn't in vain. Driving home with David, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. My quiet, methodical husband had been a spy. My in-laws were potentially foreign agents, and I was sitting on information that could expose an international conspiracy. But most shocking of all was the realization that James had known this day would come. Every document he'd preserved, every legal precaution he'd taken, every detail he'd recorded in his journal had all been preparation for the war I was now fighting, a war that had started long before September 11th and wouldn't end until justice was served. While federal agents were revealing the shocking truth about James's secret life, the rest of my world continued to offer the kind of support that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with our community 30 years ago. The contrast between the dark conspiracy I was uncovering and the genuine warmth of our friends and neighbors was both comforting and surreal. Our mailbox overflowed daily with sympathy cards and letters from people whose lives James had touched. Mrs. Henderson from down the street had organized a meal train that kept our refrigerator stocked for weeks. The church had set up a fund to help with funeral expenses. Even James's former colleagues from his legitimate consulting work had reached out with offers of support and beautiful memories of his kindness. I kept every card, reading them when the weight of the federal investigation became too heavy to bear. They painted a picture of the James I'd known and loved, not the secret agent or target of international conspiracies, but the gentle man who'd helped neighbors with their taxes, volunteered to coach Little League, and always remembered birthdays. Norma read one card from his longtime client, Patricia Williams. James was the most ethical businessman I ever worked with. When our company was struggling, he restructured his consulting fees so we could afford his help. He always said that doing the right thing was more important than making money. You should be proud of the man you married. Another, from Tom Bradley at the hardware store, brought tears to my eyes. James came in every Saturday morning for 20 years, always asking about my family, always patient when I couldn't find what he needed. Last month, he helped my son with a job interview, spending his own time to practice questions with him. My boy got the job. That's the kind of man your husband was. The cards kept coming. Stories of James quietly helping people, solving problems, being present when others needed him. Sarah Martinez, James's secretary at the consulting firm, wrote, "Mr. Preston never talked about himself, but he always remembered details about our lives. When my mother was sick, he gave me extra time off without reducing my pay. When I worried about my daughter's college tuition, he connected me with scholarship opportunities. He was more than a boss, he was a mentor and a friend." These stories felt like treasures in the midst of my legal and security nightmares. They reminded me of the real James, the man I'd shared breakfast with every morning for 32 years. Not the classified operative the government was describing, but perhaps the most meaningful support came from an unexpected source. A week after my meeting with the federal agents, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a collection of photographs and a handwritten note. "Mrs. Preston, you don't know me, but I worked with your husband on his final project. I can't say much about our work together, but I wanted you to know that James talked about you constantly. He carried your picture in his briefcase and showed it to everyone who would listen. He was so proud of your teaching career, so grateful for your patience with his travel schedule, so worried about protecting you from the dangerous aspects of his work. He called you his anchor, the reason he could do difficult things in service of his country. Please know that his colleagues saw how much he loved you and were honored to have worked alongside such a dedicated man. You were his strength, and his memory will be our inspiration." The photographs showed James in meetings with people I didn't recognize, all of them in business suits, all looking serious and professional. But in every photo where James appeared, he was wearing the small American flag pin I'd given him for his birthday, the one he'd claimed was too flashy for his taste. Apparently, it hadn't been too flashy for classified government work. Our adult children, Michael and Sarah, had been fielding their own flood of condolences and support. Michael showed me a folder of emails from James's former colleagues, many of whom I'd never met. "Dad made an impression on people. Mom," Michael said, reading through the messages, "listen to this one. Your father was the most principled man I ever worked with. In an industry full of people cutting corners and compromising ethics, James never wavered from doing what he thought was right. He was respected not just for his intelligence, but for his integrity. Sarah had compiled a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about Flight 93's heroes, many of which mentioned James by name. "Look at this one, Mom," she said, pointing to an article from the Philadelphia Inquirer. James Preston, 63, of suburban Virginia, was described by colleagues as a quiet leader who believed in serving others. His wife Norma said he called her every morning when he traveled, no matter where his work took him. "He was my constant," she said. "He made everyone around him feel valued and protected." Reading these tributes, I began to understand that James's double life hadn't made him a different person. It had simply been another expression of the protective, service-oriented nature that had defined him throughout our marriage. Whether he was helping a neighbor fix a leaky faucet or analyzing security vulnerabilities for the Department of Defense, he was always trying to make the world safer for the people he loved. The community support also provided a stark contrast to his parents' cold legal maneuvering. While hundreds of people were reaching out with love and memories, Robert and Helen Preston remained silent except for their lawyers threatening communications. The difference was telling, and it would prove crucial when we had to demonstrate to a court which relationships had truly mattered to James. But even as I drew strength from the outpouring of community love, I couldn't forget Agent Martinez's warning that the danger wasn't over. Someone was still pulling the strings behind his parents' lawsuit, still trying to access James's classified work, still pursuing objectives that had led to my husband's death. The warmth of our friends' support was real and precious, but it couldn't protect me from the shadowy war that James had died fighting. For that, I would need courage I wasn't sure I possessed, and allies I was only beginning to understand. The call from the Pentagon came on a Tuesday morning in early November, almost 2 months after 9/11. I was grading my third graders' math homework at the kitchen table when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. "Mrs. Preston, this is Colonel Rebecca Morrison from the Pentagon's Special Operations Division. I need to speak with you about your late husband's work for the Department of Defense." My hands started shaking. Despite everything David Chen and the federal agents had told me, hearing directly from the Pentagon made James's secret life feel suddenly, shockingly real. "I'm calling to inform you that your husband's final mission has been declassified to a limited extent, and there are materials in his possession that we need to secure. Additionally, there are aspects of his death that we believe you have a right to know." "What kind of aspects, ma'am?" "This isn't a conversation for the telephone. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning? And please bring your attorney. You'll want legal representation for what I have to tell you." The next morning, David and I sat in Colonel Morrison's Pentagon office, surrounded by American flags and commendation plaques. She was a small woman, with steel gray hair and eyes that had clearly seen things she couldn't discuss. On her desk was a thick file marked with security classifications I'd only seen in movies. "Mrs. Preston, your husband was one of our most valuable civilian consultants," Colonel Morrison began. "For the past 18 months, he'd been working on Operation Safeguard, a classified initiative to identify vulnerabilities in American corporate infrastructure that foreign intelligence services might exploit." She opened the file and pulled out a photograph of James in what looked like a high-level briefing room, surrounded by military officials and men in suits. James wasn't just analyzing vulnerabilities, he was tracking a specific network of foreign operatives who had been infiltrating American businesses for over a decade. His work was instrumental in identifying key players in what we now know was a much larger operation. David leaned forward. "How does this relate to the estate lawsuit?" Colonel Morrison's expression darkened. "Because the people your husband was investigating knew he was closing in on them. They needed him eliminated, and September 11th provided the perfect opportunity." She pulled out another document, this one marked with red top-secret stamps. Flight 93 wasn't chosen randomly. The passenger manifest was carefully studied by the hijacker's handlers. Your husband was specifically targeted because of his knowledge of the Meridian Consulting Network. I felt the room spinning. "Are you saying James was murdered? That he was supposed to die that day?" "I'm saying that intelligence we've gathered since 9/11 confirms that several passengers on Flight 93 were specifically selected for elimination. Your husband was the primary target." Colonel Morrison opened a laptop and showed us surveillance footage from Newark Airport on September 11th. There was James, checking in for his flight, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. "What makes this particularly significant is what your husband was carrying with him that day," she continued. He had completed his final report on the Meridian Network, a comprehensive analysis that identified over 24 American citizens who had been compromised by foreign intelligence. What happened to the report? It was destroyed in the crash, along with your husband. But we believe he left backup materials at home, files, computer data, possibly physical documents that could reconstruct his findings. David and I exchanged glances. The safe in our basement, the files James had been so secretive about. Colonel Morrison pulled out an official-looking document. Mrs. Preston, I have here a presidential finding that authorizes the Department of Defense to secure any classified materials that your husband may have left in unsecured locations. We need to search your home. What about his parents' lawsuit? How does this affect the lawsuit? Is a direct result of his investigation. Colonel Morrison interrupted. Robert and Helen Preston were recruited by Meridian Consulting specifically because of their relationship to your husband. They've been feeding information to foreign agents for over a year. She showed us photographs of James's parents meeting with Marcus Webb and other people I didn't recognize. These surveillance photos show your in-laws receiving payments from Meridian operatives. They were paid to provide intelligence about your husband's travel schedule, his work patterns, even details about your home security. I felt sick. They helped plan his murder. They provided information that was used to target him, yes. Whether they fully understood the implications of their cooperation is still being determined. Colonel Morrison closed the laptop and looked directly at me. Mrs. Preston, your husband died protecting information that could save American lives. His final report identified a network that has been operating in this country for over a decade, compromising everything from defense contractors to financial institutions. But the report was destroyed in the crash. The formal report was destroyed. But your husband was too careful and operative to keep all his information in one place. We believe he left backup materials that could help us reconstruct his findings and complete his mission. She handed me a search warrant signed by a federal judge. We need to access your home immediately. And we need you to open any safes or secured areas where your husband might have stored classified materials. David reviewed the warrant carefully. This is legal, Norma, and given what we've learned about the lawsuit, cooperating with this search might be our best defense. As we prepared to leave for my house, Colonel Morrison handed me a final document. This is a letter your husband left with his handler, to be delivered to you if anything happened to him during the operation. With trembling hands, I opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper in James's careful handwriting. My dearest Norma, if you're reading this, then the mission has gone wrong and I won't be coming home. I want you to know that everything I've done has been to protect our country and our family. The people I've been investigating are dangerous, and they will likely try to hurt you to get to information I've left behind. Trust the government agents who contact you. Trust David Chen. Trust our children. But don't trust my parents. They've been compromised and are no longer acting in your best interests. The safe in our basement contains everything the authorities will need to complete my work. The combination is our wedding date, June 15, 69. I love you more than life itself. And I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth about my work. You were my reason for fighting, and you'll be my reason for whatever comes next. Forever yours, James. As I finished reading, I realized that the gentleman I'd shared my life with had been carrying the weight of national security on his shoulders, protecting not just me but countless other Americans from threats I couldn't even imagine. And now it was my turn to carry that weight, to help complete the mission that had cost him his life, and to ensure that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The war James had been fighting was about to move into our home, and I was about to become a soldier in a battle I'd never known existed. Opening James's safe felt like crossing into another world. The basement that had always been his quiet retreats, filled with his woodworking tools and modeled trains, suddenly became the nerve center of a national security operation I'd never known existed. Colonel Morrison and 2 other federal agents watched as I entered the combination, June 15, 69, our wedding date. The heavy door swung open to reveal stacks of files, computer disks, photographs, and documents that looked nothing like the business consulting materials I'd expected. Mrs. Preston, Colonel Morrison said softly, what you're about to see is classified at the highest levels. You'll need to sign a security agreement before we proceed. I signed the papers with shaking hands, still struggling to accept that my gentle husband had been living this double life. The first file Colonel Morrison pulled from the safe was labeled, Meridian Network personnel files and contained detailed dossiers on dozens of American citizens. Your husband had been tracking this network for 18 months, she explained, opening the file to reveal photographs and surveillance reports. Meridian Consulting appears to be a legitimate business consulting firm, but it's actually a front for a foreign intelligence operation that specializes in recruiting Americans with financial problems. The first dossier made my blood run cold. Robert and Helen Preston, complete with financial records, psychological profiles, and a detailed recruitment timeline. James had been investigating his own parents. According to this file, your in-laws were first approached by Meridian in March 2001, Colonel Morrison continued. They were facing bankruptcy when Marcus Webb made contact, offering to solve their financial problems in exchange for information about their son. The file showed bank records, recorded phone conversations, and even photographs of James's parents meeting with foreign operatives. They hadn't just been recruited, they'd been thoroughly compromised. But this is what makes your husband's work so valuable, Colonel Morrison said, pulling out a thick folder labeled Security Clearance Documentation. He didn't just identify the network, he identified the specific government, contracts and defense systems they were trying to access. Inside were copies of security clearance applications, background investigations, and access authorizations I'd never known James possessed. He wasn't just a management consultant, he held top-secret clearances from multiple defense departments. Your husband had been working as a deep-cover operative for 3 years, Colonel Morrison explained. His consulting business was real, but it also provided perfect cover for investigating corporate security vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence services might exploit. She showed me photographs of James in meetings with high-ranking military officials, FBI directors, and people whose faces I recognized from news broadcasts. He was one of our most effective civilian assets because no one suspected that a quiet management consultant from Virginia was actually tracking international espionage networks. The scope of James's real work was staggering. Files showed investigations into defense contractors, technology companies, financial institutions, and government agencies that had been infiltrated by foreign operatives. The Meridian Network was just one of several operations he'd been tracking. This is why the people behind Meridian wanted him dead, Colonel Morrison said, pointing to a file labeled Active Threats Assessment. Your husband had identified not just the American assets they'd recruited, but the foreign intelligence officers running the operations. Inside were photographs and profiles of men and women who looked like ordinary business professionals but were actually foreign spies operating in major American cities. James had been building cases against an entire network of enemy agents. The September 11th attacks provided them with perfect cover to eliminate your husband while making it look like he was just an unfortunate victim of terrorism, Colonel Morrison continued. But what they didn't anticipate was how thoroughly he'd documented everything. She pulled out the most shocking file yet, Flight 93 passenger selection criteria. Inside were intelligence reports showing that the hijackers had specifically chosen Flight 93 because of its passenger manifest. Your husband wasn't the only target on that plane, Colonel Morrison revealed. 3 other passengers were also carrying classified information that foreign intelligence services wanted destroyed. The hijackers knew exactly who they were killing. I felt nauseated. The heroes of Flight 93 hadn't just been fighting to save lives in Washington, they'd been protecting national security secrets that could have compromised ongoing operations worldwide. This is why your in-laws' lawsuit is so dangerous, Colonel Morrison explained. If they gain access to your husband's estate, they'll also gain access to any classified materials he might have left unsecured. The foreign operatives who recruited them are still active, still trying to complete their mission. She handed me another file, Preston, Estate Security Assessment. James had anticipated this exact scenario and had worked with government lawyers to create legal barriers that would prevent his parents from accessing sensitive materials. Your husband wasn't just protecting you from financial hardship, Colonel Morrison said. He was protecting national security. Every legal document he filed, every estate planning decision he made, was designed to keep classified information out of enemy hands. As the agents carefully catalogued James's files, I began to understand the enormous weight my husband had been carrying. He'd been fighting a secret war while maintaining the facade of a normal suburban life, protecting not just our family, but countless Americans from threats they'd never know existed. but I also realized that his death hadn't ended the war. It had simply transferred the battle to a new front. His parents' lawsuit wasn't just about money or family grievances. It was the continuation of an espionage operation that had already cost my husband his life. And now, whether I wanted it or not, I was a soldier in that same war, holding secrets that could save or destroy American lives depending on who gained access to them. The gentleman I'd married had been a hero on a scale I'd never imagined. Now, I had to find the strength to be worthy of his sacrifice and to protect the mission he'd died completing. The most devastating revelation came when Colonel Morrison opened the final file from James's safe, a manila folder labeled Flight 93, Mission Brief with official Department of Defense letterhead. Inside were documents that transformed everything I thought I knew about my husband's death. Mrs. Preston, your husband wasn't traveling to New York for a business meeting on September 11th, Colonel Morrison said quietly. He was on a classified mission to deliver his final report on the Meridian Network to the FBI field office in New York. She pulled out an official travel authorization dated September 10, 2001. James Robert Preston, Security Clearance, TSSCI, authorized for emergency transport to NYC Field Office for delivery of classified materials relating to Operation Safeguard, mission-critical foreign assets identified for immediate arrest. I stared at the document, my hands trembling. He was supposed to expose the spy network that day. More than expose it, he was going to trigger the largest counterintelligence operation in FBI history. Over 40 foreign operatives were going to be arrested simultaneously based on your husband's investigation. Colonel Morrison showed me a second document, the official passenger manifest for Flight 93, with government annotations in red ink. Next to James's name was a notation that made my blood run cold. Primary target, eliminate before NYC arrival. The intelligence community now believes that the 9/11 attacks were planned not just to terrorize America, but to eliminate specific individuals who posed threats to foreign intelligence operations, she explained. Your husband was the primary target on Flight 93. She opened her laptop and showed me satellite surveillance footage from the morning of September 11th. Watch this. Your husband's movements were being tracked from the moment he left your house. The footage showed James leaving our driveway, stopping for coffee, arriving at the airport, but it also showed other vehicles following him, men with cameras documenting his every move. They knew his exact schedule because his parents had been feeding them intelligence for months. Colonel Morrison continued. Every detail of his travel patterns, his usual routes, even his preferred airlines, all provided by Robert and Helen Preston. The betrayal was stunning. James's own parents had helped plan his assassination while he was working to protect American national security. But here's what makes this particularly significant, Colonel Morrison said, pulling out a communication, intercept dated September 10th. We captured this conversation between Marcus Webb and an unidentified foreign contact. She played an audio recording that made my stomach turn. The package will be eliminated during tomorrow's operation. Our assets confirm he boards the 8:15 flight as scheduled. The materials he's carrying will be destroyed with him. What about the backup files? Our domestic contacts will handle that. The parents have been prepared to claim the estate and secure any remaining documents. I felt sick. They knew James was going to die. They planned it. They executed it. And now they're trying to complete their mission by gaining access to his classified files through the estate lawsuit. Colonel Morrison confirmed. She showed me another document, an analysis of Flight 93's passenger manifest that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Your husband wasn't the only target. 3 other passengers were also carrying sensitive information that foreign intelligence wanted destroyed. Mark Rothschild, a cybersecurity expert working on defense contractor vulnerabilities. Lisa Chen, a financial analyst tracking money laundering operations. Thomas Burke, a telecommunications engineer with access to communication intercept capabilities. All 4 of these passengers were specifically targeted for elimination, Colonel Morrison explained. The hijackers knew exactly who they were killing and why. The heroic story of Flight 93 that had been told to the American public was true, but it was incomplete. The passengers who fought back weren't just saving lives in Washington. They were protecting classified operations that could have compromised American national security for decades. This is why your husband's files are so critical, Colonel Morrison continued. His investigation identified not just the Meridian Network, but connections to other foreign operations that are still active. She pulled out a map marked with red pins across the United States. Based on your husband's research, we believe there are at least 6 other networks operating in major American cities. His death stopped us from rolling up all of them. The weight of it was overwhelming. James hadn't just been my husband, he had been protecting the entire country from threats most Americans would never know existed. So what happens now? I asked. Colonel Morrison closed the laptop and looked directly at me. Now we use your husband's files to complete his mission. We arrest the foreign operatives he identified. We shut down the networks he'd been tracking, and we make sure his parents and their handlers never get access to the classified information they're trying to steal. She handed me a sealed envelope marked from Mrs. James Preston, eyes only. Your husband left specific instructions for this. Sanari, he knew that if his mission failed, it would be up to you to help us finish what he started. Inside was a handwritten note from James. Norma, if you're reading this, then our country needs you to be stronger than you've ever been. The files in our safe contain information that could save thousands of American lives, but only if they stay in the right hands. Trust Colonel Morrison. Trust David Chen. But remember that my parents are no longer the people who raised me. They've been turned against everything we believe in. Don't let grief or guilt make you vulnerable to their manipulation. Complete my mission. Protect our country. Make my sacrifice matter. I love you, James. As I finished reading, I realized that my quiet life as a suburban teacher was over. I was now part of a classified operation that my husband had died protecting. The lawsuit from his parents wasn't just a family dispute, it was an act of espionage that I had to help stop. The man I'd said goodbye to on September 11th had been carrying the weight of national security on his shoulders. Now that weight was mine to bear, and I had to find the courage to be worthy of his trust. The revelation that James had been a targeted victim, rather than a random casualty of 9/11's, transformed our legal strategy completely. David Chen's conference room felt different when we met the next morning, no longer just a place to discuss inheritance law, but a war room where we'd plan our counterattack against foreign operatives. Everything changes now, David said, reviewing the classified documents that Colonel Morrison had authorized him to see. This isn't just an estate dispute, it's a national security case. Agent Martinez joined us, bringing additional evidence that the FBI had been developing since our basement search. We've been monitoring your in-laws' communications since Colonel Morrison briefed us. They're in regular contact with Marcus Webb, and he's in contact with foreign handlers. She played a recorded phone conversation from just 2 days earlier. Helen Preston's voice. The government people were at her house. They took things from the basement. Marcus Webb. What kind of things? Helen. Files. Computers. James always kept work stuff down there. But we thought it was just business papers. Webb. This complicates our timeline. We need to accelerate the estate proceedings. The longer this drags out, the more likely the authorities will interfere. Helen. What if Norma won't settle? What if she fights us? Webb. Then we'll have to pursue alternative methods to secure the materials we need. The threat was clear. If legal means didn't work, they were prepared to use other methods to get James's classified information. That's why we're taking a different approach, David explained, pulling out documents that had been prepared in coordination with the Department of Justice. Instead of just defending against their lawsuit, we're going on the offense. Agent Martinez handed me a thick legal filing. We're charging Robert and Helen Preston with violation of the Espionage Act, conspiracy to commit treason, and accessory to murder in connection with the September 11th attacks. I stared at the documents, feeling overwhelmed. You're arresting James's parents. We're giving them one chance to cooperate, Agent Martinez replied. If they agree to testify against their foreign handlers and provide information about other compromised Americans, they might avoid life sentences. David spread out the legal strategy across his conference table. Here's how this works. We file a motion to dismiss their estate lawsuit on national security grounds. At the same time, the Justice Department files criminal charges. Will have to choose between continuing their espionage activities or cooperating with the investigation. What if they choose to cooperate? Then we might finally get the full scope of how many Americans have been compromised by foreign intelligence, Agent Martinez said. Your husband's files identified dozens of potential assets, but your in-laws could help us understand the complete network. Colonel Morrison arrived with additional documentation that would be filed under seal with the federal court. The judge hearing your estate case has been briefed on the national security implications. She's been authorized to review classified materials that demonstrate why the estate must remain in your control. She handed David a letter signed by the Attorney General of the United States. This document certifies that James Preston died in service to his country while conducting classified operations vital to national security. Any attempt to access his estate by unauthorized individuals represents a clear and present danger to ongoing counterintelligence operations. In simple terms, David explained, the federal government is intervening in your favor. Your lawsuit is going to fail spectacularly. But the legal victory was just the beginning. Agent Martinez opened another file showing surveillance photos of Marcus Webb meeting with people I didn't recognize. Webb isn't just a lawyer, he's a recruitment coordinator for foreign intelligence services. His job is to identify and compromise Americans with access to sensitive information. Your in-laws were just one of dozens of families he's manipulated. She showed me a chart mapping connections between Webb and other compromised Americans across the country. Based on your husband's investigation and what we've learned since, we believe this network has been operating for over a decade. They've infiltrated defense contractors, government agencies, financial institutions, even academic research facilities. Colonel Morrison pulled out a map of the United States marked with red pins. Each of these pins represents a confirmed or suspected foreign asset. Your husband's work identified most of them, but there are still active operations we haven't shut down. What does this mean for me? I asked. It means you're not just a widow fighting a family lawsuit, Agent Martinez replied. You're a critical witness in the largest counterintelligence operation since the Cold War. Your husband's files are helping us dismantle an espionage network that's been operating in this country for years. David handed me a document to sign. This authorizes the government to use James's classified materials as evidence in criminal prosecutions. It also provides you with federal protection if Webb's handlers decide to try alternative methods to access the information. Federal protection. The words hit me like ice water. You think they'll try to hurt me? We think they've already killed your husband to protect their operation, Colonel Morrison said bluntly. We're not taking any chances with your safety. Agent Martinez stood up and walked to the window. Mrs. Preston, within the next 72 hours, we're going to arrest 43 foreign operatives and compromised Americans across 6 states. This is the culmination of your husband's investigation. James's mission will finally be completed. His mission will be completed because you chose to trust us instead of being intimidated by your in-law's lawsuit. Colonel Morrison replied, without your cooperation, those files would have remained locked in that safe, and the people who killed your husband would have eventually found another way to access them. As we prepared to leave the meeting, David handed me one final document, a court order dismissing Robert and Helen Preston's estate lawsuit with prejudice. It's over, he said simply. The judge ruled that the national security implications make their claims invalid. You retain full control of James's estate, and they have no further legal standing to challenge that decision. But I knew the real battle was just beginning. James's parents would be arrested within hours. The foreign operatives who had recruited them would soon follow. And somewhere in the shadows, other enemies of America were planning their next move. My husband had died, protecting secrets that could save American lives. Now those secrets were finally being used to complete the mission he'd given his life for. The war James had been fighting in secret was about to become very public. And justice was finally within reach. The arrest warrants were served at dawn, on a gray November morning. I watched from my living room window as FBI agents surrounded Robert and Helen Preston's house in Philadelphia. Knowing that this moment represented both justice for James and the final destruction of what remained of his family, Agent Martinez called me as the arrests were taking place. They're in custody. Both of them invoked their right to counsel immediately, but we found significant evidence at their residence. Within hours, David Chen received an unexpected phone call that changed everything about how I understood James's parents' desperation. Mrs. Preston, Marcus Webb's voice was different now, pleading, almost frantic. We need to discuss a settlement immediately. My clients are willing to drop their estate claim in exchange for certain assurances. David put the call on speaker so I could hear. What kind of assurances, Mr. Webb? Assurances that Mrs. Preston won't cooperate with any federal investigations that might implicate my clients in matters unrelated to the estate dispute. The audacity was breathtaking. Even after being arrested on espionage charges, they were still trying to negotiate. Mr. Webb, David replied calmly, your clients were arrested this morning on federal charges. They're hardly in a position to negotiate anything. There was a long pause. Then Webb's voice returned, but now it carried a tone of barely controlled panic. You don't understand the situation. If my clients are forced to testify about their relationship with certain consulting firms, it will expose arrangements that could be embarrassing to many prominent Americans. Agent Martinez, who had been listening on another line, jumped in. Mr. Webb, this is Special Agent Martinez with the FBI. Are you attempting to obstruct a federal investigation? The line went dead. Later that afternoon, I received an even more disturbing call, this one directly from Helen Preston, calling from the Federal Detention Center where she was being held. Norma, please, you have to help us. Her voice was shaking, completely different from the cold, calculated woman who had served me with a lawsuit just weeks earlier. We didn't know. We never knew what they really wanted. Helen, I can't talk to you without lawyers present. They told us James was sharing classified information with foreign competitors. They said he was betraying his country for money, and that we were patriots for helping stop him. I felt sick. What Marcus Webb showed us documents, photographs, bank records. They convinced us that James was selling government secrets to Chinese companies. They said the only way to stop him was to help them monitor his activities. The manipulation was more sophisticated than I'd imagined. James's parents hadn't just been recruited by foreign operatives, they'd been convinced that their son was the traitor. We thought we were protecting America, Helen continued, her voice breaking. They said James was going to sell information that would get American soldiers killed. We thought we were saving lives. Agent Martinez, who had been monitoring the call, signaled for me to keep Helen talking. What kind of information did you give them? Everything. His travel schedule, his work contacts, when he'd be carrying sensitive materials. They said they needed to know when to intercept him before he could complete a sale to foreign buyers. The cruelty of the deception was stunning. Webb's handlers had turned James's own parents into weapons against him by convincing them that he was the enemy they were supposed to be fighting. Helen, James wasn't selling secrets. He was trying to stop foreign spies who were operating in America. That can't be true. Marcus showed us proof. The proof was fabricated. James was working for the U.S. government, not against it. You helped foreign operatives kill your own son. The silence on the line stretched for nearly a minute. When Helen spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Oh God. Oh my God. What have we done? Over the next several hours, as their lawyers negotiated plea agreements, the full scope of Robert and Helen's manipulation became clear. Webb's organization had spent months preparing an elaborate deception, complete with forged documents, fake intelligence reports, and staged photographs that proved James was committing treason. The private investigator report that David had mentioned in our legal meetings revealed the extent of their desperation in the final weeks. After learning about the federal investigation, James's parents had hired investigators to find evidence that could discredit me or prove that James had hidden assets overseas. They were looking for anything that could support their claim that James was a traitor. Agent Martinez explained. Bank accounts in foreign countries, communications with suspicious contacts, evidence of unexplained wealth. They were trying to build a case that would justify their cooperation with Webb's network, but the investigators had found nothing because there was nothing to find. James had been exactly what the government said he was, a loyal American who had died protecting his country from the very people who had recruited his parents. The psychological profiles that the FBI had developed showed how perfectly Robert and Helen Preston had fit the recruitment criteria for foreign intelligence operations, financially desperate, emotionally estranged from their target, and nursing years of resentment that could be exploited and directed. Classic recruitment pattern, Agent Martinez said. Find people with access to the target, exploit their vulnerabilities, and give them a narrative that makes them feel like heroes instead of traitors. As evening fell, I sat in my quiet house, thinking about the phone call from Helen. Despite everything they had done, despite their role in James's death, I felt a crushing sadness for two elderly people who had been so thoroughly manipulated that they'd become accessories to their own son's murder. But I also understood that their desperation in recent weeks hadn't just been about money or family pride. They'd been trying to prove that their dead son was the traitor, not them. The lawsuit, the investigators, the attempts to discredit me, of it had been their effort to avoid facing the truth about what they'd done. Now, sitting in federal detention cells, they would have to confront the reality that their manipulation had led directly to James's death. And I would have to find a way to live with the knowledge that my husband had died because his own parents had been turned against him. The war that James had been fighting wasn't just against foreign enemies, was against the human weaknesses that made ordinary Americans vulnerable to recruitment by those enemies: pride, greed, resentment, desperation. The emotions that had torn our family apart had been weaponized against the country James had died protecting. Justice was coming, but it would be cold comfort for the family that had been destroyed. In the process, the document that changed everything arrived on a Thursday morning in late November, delivered by federal courier to David Chin's office. It was James's final mission report, the one he'd been carrying to New York on September 11th. Reconstructed from backup files found in his safe and preliminary notes discovered in his Pentagon office. Colonel Morrison called it the most comprehensive counterintelligence analysis in FBI history. As I sat in a secure government facility reading the classified summary she was authorized to share with me, I finally understood the full scope of what my husband had been fighting and why he'd had to die. Operation Safeguard wasn't just about identifying foreign spies operating in America, Colonel Morrison explained. Your husband had uncovered something much bigger: a coordinated effort by multiple foreign intelligence services to infiltrate and compromise American infrastructure. At every level, the report detailed a network that went far beyond Meridian Consulting. James had identified foreign operatives working inside defense contractors, technology companies, financial institutions, government agencies, and academic research centers, but more shocking was his discovery of how they coordinated their activities. Your husband found evidence of regular communication between Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and North Korean intelligence services. Colonel Morrison continued. They weren't competing with each other for American secrets. They were sharing information and coordinating their recruitment efforts. James's final report contained an organizational chart that read like a nightmare scenario for American national security. Foreign intelligence services had been pooling their resources to create the most comprehensive espionage network in U.S. history. The September 11th attacks provided perfect cover for eliminating the one person who understood the full scope of their operation. Colonel Morrison said, your husband's death wasn't just about protecting the Meridian network, it was about protecting a much larger conspiracy. She handed me a declassified section of James's report titled Strategic Assessment. His analysis predicted that if the network remained undetected, foreign intelligence services would gain access to virtually every aspect of American defense, economic, and technological capabilities within 5 years. James wasn't just tracking current operations, he was projecting future threats, Colonel Morrison explained. His report identified vulnerabilities that foreign services could exploit to cripple American infrastructure, compromise military operations, and steal technological innovations before they could be implemented. The scope was staggering. James had documented how foreign operatives were systematically recruiting Americans with access to power grids, communication networks, transportation systems, financial markets, and defense installations. The goal wasn't just espionage, it was positioning for potential sabotage in case of future conflicts. This is why your husband's work was so critical, Colonel Morrison said. He'd identified not just what they were doing, but what they were preparing to do. She opened a laptop and showed me a map of the United States covered with interconnected red lines. Each line represents a connection your husband identified between foreign operatives and critical American infrastructure. If this network had remained operational, they could have caused simultaneous failures across multiple systems. The final section of James's report was titled Immediate Action Required, and contained a list of 47 Americans who needed to be arrested immediately to prevent the network from going operational. Your husband's final mission was to deliver this list to the FBI, so they could execute coordinated arrests before the network realized they'd been compromised. Colonel Morrison explained. His death delayed those arrests by 2 months, but we were finally able to act based on the files you helped us recover. She handed me a summary of the arrests that had taken place over the past week. 43 of the 47 people on James's list had been taken into custody. The other 4 had apparently been warned and had fled the country. But here's the most important part, Colonel Morrison said, pulling out James's personal assessment of the mission. Your husband knew he was walking into danger on September 11th. His final notes indicate that he suspected the network had become aware of his investigation. She showed me a handwritten note dated September 10, 2001. Mission parameters have changed. Intelligence suggests potential compromise of operation. Proceeding as scheduled despite elevated risk. If this mission fails, backup materials in HomeSafe contain everything needed to complete the investigation. Norma has been prepared through legal documentation to provide access to authorized personnel. Operation Safeguard must not fail even if I do. I stared at the note, realizing that James had known he might not survive his final mission. He'd gone to New York knowing it could be a trap, but he'd gone anyway because the stakes were too high to delay. Your husband chose to complete his mission even when he suspected it might cost him his life, Colonel Morrison said quietly. He died protecting information that has now saved American lives and prevented what could have been the most devastating intelligence compromise in U.S. history. She handed me one final document, a presidential citation that would be awarded posthumously to James for his service to the country. The citation was classified and would never be made public, but it officially recognized him as a hero who had died in service to America. Mrs. Preston, your husband's sacrifice prevented a catastrophe that most Americans will never know was even possible. Because of his work, because of your cooperation, and because of the files he left behind, we've dismantled the largest foreign intelligence network ever discovered on American soil. As I sat in that secure room, holding documents that revealed the true scope of James's heroism, I finally understood why he'd been so secretive in his final months. He hadn't just been protecting me from worry, he'd been protecting me from knowledge that could have made me a target. The gentleman who'd kissed me goodbye on September 11th had been carrying the weight of national security on his shoulders. He'd died not just as a victim of terrorism, but as a warrior who'd given his life to protect his country from enemies most Americans would never even know existed. His final mission was complete. The network he'd spent 18 months investigating had been destroyed. The foreign operatives who'd recruited his parents were in custody, and the classified information he'd died protecting was finally being used to safeguard the nation he'd loved. James Robert Preston had been a hero on a scale that would never be publicly acknowledged, but I knew, the government knew, and somewhere, in the classified archives of American intelligence, his sacrifice would be remembered forever. The final court hearing took place on a cold December morning, almost 4 months after 9/11. Federal Judge Patricia Williams had been briefed on the classified aspects of the case, and the courtroom was closed to the public due to national security concerns. Only essential personnel were present, David Chen and myself. The federal prosecutors, and Marcus Webb representing Robert and Helen Preston via video link from federal detention. Judge Williams entered the courtroom carrying a thick file marked with security classifications. Her expression was grave as she addressed the nearly empty room. This case began as a simple estate dispute, she said, but has evolved into something far more serious. After reviewing classified materials submitted by the Department of Justice, I am prepared to issue my final ruling. David squeezed my hand as the judge continued. The evidence presented demonstrates beyond any doubt that James Robert Preston died while serving his country in a classified capacity. His estate planning decisions were made with full knowledge of the risks he faced and represent his deliberate choices regarding the protection of his family and national security interests. She looked directly at the video screen where Marcus Webb sat with James's parents. The petitioners claimed that Mrs. Preston exercised undue influence over her husband's estate planning is not only without merit, it is contradicted by extensive documentation showing that Mr. Preston made these decisions to protect classified information from unauthorized access. Judge Williams opened the file and read from an official document. Furthermore, the evidence shows that Robert and Helen Preston were compromised by foreign intelligence operatives and provided information that directly contributed to their son's death. Under these circumstances, any claim they might have had to his estate is voided by their criminal conduct. I watched the video screen as Helen Preston began crying. Even through the poor video quality, I could see the devastation on her face as the judge's words confirmed what she'd been trying to deny, that she and Robert had helped kill their own son. The court finds that the estate lawsuit filed by Robert and Helen Preston was not a legitimate legal action, but rather a continuation of the espionage activities that led to James Preston's death. Judge Williams continued, "This court will not allow American legal processes to be manipulated by foreign intelligence services. The judge's final ruling was comprehensive and devastating to any future challenges. She officially declared that James's estate planning had been conducted with full legal authority and clear mental capacity. She ruled that his parents had forfeited any inheritance rights through their criminal conduct. And most importantly, she sealed all records related to the case to protect ongoing national security operations. Mrs. Norma Preston is hereby confirmed as the sole legitimate heir to her husband's estate, Judge Williams announced. All claims by Robert and Helen Preston are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled under any circumstances. But the judge wasn't finished. She turned to address Marcus Webb directly through the video link. Mr. Webb, this court is recommending that the Virginia State Bar investigate your conduct in this matter. Using legal processes to advance foreign intelligence operations is a violation of every ethical standard of the legal profession. After the hearing, David and I stood on the courthouse steps in the December cold. The legal battle that had consumed months of my life was finally over. But the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring James back or repair the family that had been destroyed in the process. It's finished, David said simply. No appeals, no further challenges. James's estate is secure, and the classified materials are protected. Agent Martinez joined us on the courthouse steps with news about the broader investigation. The network your husband identified has been completely dismantled. 43 arrests, 17 convictions so far, and we've prevented what could have been catastrophic damage to American security. She handed me a letter from the Attorney General thanking me for my cooperation in the investigation. Your husband's work has been briefed to the President. While it can never be made public, the highest levels of government know what he sacrificed for this country. As we walked back to David's office, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning in September. I'd lost my husband, in the most horrific way imaginable. But I'd also discovered that he was a hero whose sacrifice had protected countless American lives. The legal victory was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I was no longer just a widow fighting for her husband's memory. Was the guardian of a legacy that had helped save the nation he'd died protecting. But I was also a woman who would have to live with the knowledge that James's own parents had been turned against him. Robert and Helen Preston would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, knowing that their manipulation had led to their son's death. There would be no family reconciliation, no healing of old wounds, no redemption. For the choices they'd made, the courtroom justice we'd achieved was complete and final. The foreign operatives who'd killed James were in custody. The network he'd been investigating was destroyed. His parents would face the consequences of their betrayal. But real justice, the kind that could restore what had been lost, was beyond any court's power to provide. James was still gone. His parents were still destroyed by their own choices. And I was still alone with secrets I could never fully share. The legal war was over. Now I had to find a way to build a life worthy of the man who'd given everything to protect the country we both loved. The memorial service I'd been unable to have in September finally took place on a sunny Saturday in January 2002. Our church was packed with people whose lives James had touched: colleagues, neighbors, students from my classroom whose fathers he'd helped with job applications, Little League players he'd coached years earlier, and government officials who couldn't speak publicly about his classified service but came to honor him anyway. Colonel Morrison attended in civilian clothes, sitting quietly in the back row. Agent Martinez was there too, along with several other federal employees whose presence reminded everyone that James's death had been about more than family grief, had been about national service and sacrifice. I stood at the podium looking out at the faces of people who'd known different aspects of my husband. Some knew him as the gentle neighbor who shoveled their driveways after snowstorms. Others knew him as the methodical consultant who'd helped their businesses survive economic difficulties. A select few knew him as the classified operative who'd given his life protecting American national security. James lived multiple lives, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. He was a husband, a father, a neighbor, a businessman, and, as many of you now know, a patriot who served his country in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. I spoke about the man I'd married 32 years earlier, the one who'd called me every morning when he traveled, who'd worried about stepping on ants, who'd kept our wedding ring safe because he wanted me to have something to remember him by. But I also spoke about the hero he'd become in his final months. the man who'd chosen to complete a dangerous mission even when he suspected it might cost him his life. The James you knew, kind, methodical, protective, was the same man who died protecting classified information that saved American lives, I continued. His gentle nature and his patriotic service weren't separate aspects of his character. They were the same quality expressed in different ways: his need to protect the people he loved. The service included readings from colleagues who could speak publicly about James's business consulting work, and carefully worded tributes from government officials who referenced his special service to the nation without revealing classified details. Our children, Michael and Sarah, spoke about growing up with a father who'd taught them that doing the right thing was more important than personal convenience. But the most moving moment came when I read a letter that had arrived from the families of other Flight 93 passengers. They'd learned about James's classified mission and wanted to express their gratitude that their loved ones had died alongside someone who'd been serving the country in such a significant way. Knowing that our family members died protecting not just the lives in Washington, but classified information that could save future American lives, gives their sacrifice even greater meaning. The letter read, James Preston was a hero twice over, first as a classified operative, then as one of the passengers who fought back against the terrorists. After the service, people lingered in the church fellowship hall, sharing memories and asking questions about the parts of James's story that could be discussed publicly. The community support that had sustained me through the legal battle continued, but now it was informed by a deeper understanding of what James had sacrificed. Colonel Morrison approached me as the crowd was thinning. Mrs. Preston, I wanted you to know that your husband's work is still saving lives. The network we dismantled was planning operations that could have compromised military communications during the Afghanistan deployment. Because of James's investigation, our soldiers are safer. The financial aftermath of the legal battle was significant but manageable. The legal fees had been substantial, but James's life insurance and the government's assistance with expenses meant I wasn't facing financial hardship. More importantly, the successful defense of his estate meant that our children's inheritance was secure, and the house that held 32 years of memories would remain mine. But the emotional costs were harder to calculate. Learning that Robert and Helen Preston would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison brought no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for a family that had been completely destroyed by pride, manipulation, and foreign intelligence operations. The plea agreements that James's parents had eventually signed revealed the full scope of their recruitment and exploitation. They'd been manipulated for over a year, fed false information about their son's loyalty, and gradually turned into unwilling accessories to his murder. Their sentences, both their cooperation with authorities and the devastating consequences of their actions. I'd written them one letter while they awaited sentencing, not to forgive or condemn, but to help them understand the truth about the son they'd lost. I told them about James's real work, his genuine patriotism, and his love for the country they'd been convinced he was betraying. I never received a response, but through their lawyers, I learned that Helen had requested that the letter be read at their sentencing hearing. The house felt different now, not just because James was gone, but because I understood the weight he'd been carrying in his final months. His study, once just a quiet retreat where he worked on consulting projects, had been the command center for a classified operation that had saved American lives. The basement where he'd kept his model trains had also housed files that exposed the largest foreign intelligence network in U.S. history. I'd begun seeing a counselor who specialized in helping families of intelligence operatives, a therapist with security clearance who could discuss the unique challenges of learning that a loved one had been living a classified double life. The sessions helped me process not just my grief, but my pride in James's sacrifice and my anger at the family members who'd betrayed him. As winter turned to spring, I started making plans for the future. I would return to teaching in the fall, but I'd also been approached about consulting with the government on family security issues, helping to identify ways that foreign intelligence services recruited family members of classified personnel. Memorial service had marked the end of my public mourning and the beginning of a new phase of my life. I was no longer just a widow seeking justice for her husband's death. I was the guardian of a hero's legacy and a contributor to the ongoing fight against the enemies he'd died protecting. The consequences of the legal battle had been severe for everyone involved, but they'd also brought a kind of closure that allowed real healing to begin. On the first anniversary of 9/11, I stood in the Pentagon Memorial, reading James's name, engraved alongside the other victims of that terrible day. But I also carried with me a different kind of memorial, one that couldn't be carved in stone or displayed publicly, but was perhaps more meaningful than any monument. The James Preston Memorial Fund for Intelligence Families had been established, with money from his life insurance and contributions from colleagues who'd learned about his classified service. The fund provided financial assistance, counseling services, and educational scholarships for families of intelligence operatives who'd been killed or compromised in the line of duty. "Your husband would be proud," Colonel Morrison said, standing beside me at the memorial. "You've turned his sacrifice into something that protects other families facing what you went through." The fund had already assisted 12 families whose loved ones had been killed while working on classified operations. Unlike traditional military families, intelligence families often couldn't receive public recognition for their losses or access standard support services. The Preston Fund filled that gap, providing help that honored James's memory while protecting the ongoing secrecy that his work had required. My new role as a consultant on family security issues had given me purpose that went beyond personal healing. Working with the FBI and CIA, I helped develop protocols for protecting the families of classified personnel from foreign recruitment attempts. The lessons learned from James's parents' manipulation were being used to safeguard other families from similar exploitation. We've identified 17 different recruitment patterns that foreign intelligence services use to target intelligence families, I explained during a briefing at FBI headquarters. Financial pressure, family estrangement, ideological manipulation, romantic entrapment. Each approach requires different defensive measures. The work was classified and emotionally difficult, but it felt like a continuation of James's mission. Every family we protected from foreign manipulation, every recruitment attempt we detected and stopped, was a victory for the values he'd died defending. Our children had also found ways to honor their father's memory. Michael had joined the army and was training for intelligence work himself, inspired by learning about his father's classified service. Sarah had changed her college major to international relations and was planning a career in counterintelligence. Both of them carried security clearances now and understood the family legacy they'd inherited. "Dad was protecting all of us," Sarah said during a private family dinner on the anniversary. "Not just Mom, not just our immediate family, but all American families. That's what intelligence work really is, protecting people who'll never know they were in danger." The classified presidential citation honoring James's service had been framed and hung in a secure government facility, where it could be viewed by other intelligence professionals. While his heroism could never be publicly acknowledged, it inspired the men and women who continued the fight against foreign espionage. Agent Martinez had become a friend over the months since the investigation concluded. She often stopped by to check on my security and to share updates about ongoing operations that had benefited from James's work. "The network your husband identified in his final report has been completely dismantled," she told me during one of her visits, "but more importantly, his methods for detecting recruitment patterns are being used to identify new threats. His work continues to save American lives." The house that had once felt empty and haunted by secrets now felt like a sanctuary, where I could honor James's memory while building something meaningful from the tragedy of his death. His study had been converted into an office where I worked on intelligence family security issues. The basement where he'd kept his classified files now housed the administrative offices of the Memorial Fund. I started dating again, a quiet relationship with a man named David, who taught history at the local high school and understood that my late husband's service would always be part of my life. David had security clearance through his work on a Defense Department education project, which meant I could share more of my story with him than I could with most people. James set an impossible standard. I told David one evening as we walked through the neighborhood where my husband had once lived his double life, but not because he was perfect, because he was willing to sacrifice everything for principles. He believed in the legal victory over James's parents had been complete and final. They remained in federal prison, serving their sentences for espionage and accessory to murder. I'd stopped visiting them after their sentencing, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say. They'd made their choices, and those choices had destroyed our family beyond any possibility of redemption. But I'd found peace with their fate. They'd been manipulated by sophisticated foreign operatives who specialized in exploiting human weaknesses. But they'd also chosen to believe the worst. about their son rather than trust the man who'd loved them despite their estrangement. Their punishment was justice. But it was also the natural consequence of decisions that had prioritized resentment over love. As I stood at the Pentagon Memorial, reading James's name one more time, I thought about the conversation we'd had on our last morning together. He'd seemed different, more serious, almost melancholy, and I'd dismissed it as work stress. Now I understood that he'd been saying goodbye in the only way his classified life allowed. "This trip is going to change everything for us," he'd said in that final voicemail. He'd been right, though not in the way either of us had expected. His death had changed everything, transforming me from a suburban teacher into a guardian of national security secrets, turning our quiet marriage into a classified love story, making his sacrifice the foundation for work that would protect other families from the enemies he'd died fighting. James Robert Preston had been my husband for 32 years, but he'd been America's secret guardian for only 18 months. In that brief time, he'd saved more lives than most people could in several lifetimes. His legacy wasn't carved in public monuments or celebrated in history books, but it lived on in the classified operations that continued his work and in the families who were safer because of his sacrifice. The war he'd been fighting in secret was still being waged by other quiet heroes, men and women, whose families might never know the full truth about their service, but whose sacrifices protected the freedom we all took for granted. I walked away from the memorial knowing that James's mission was complete, his family was protected, and his legacy would endure in the classified archives of American intelligence. The love story that had begun with two young people in 1969 had become something larger than either of us had imagined, a testament to the hidden heroes who served their country in shadows and silence. His final victory wasn't just the destruction of the network he'd been investigating, or the protection of his estate from foreign operatives, or even the justice served against those who'd betrayed him. His final victory was the transformation of his death into a foundation for protecting other American families from the enemies who would always seek to exploit our freedoms. James Preston had lived and died as a patriot. Now it was my honor to ensure that his sacrifice would never be forgotten by the people whose job it was to continue the fight he'd given his life to win.